She moved through Oak Creek Memorial like a ghost, and no one even knew her real name. 2 years. 23 months and 14 days, to be precise. Katie Morrison had perfected the art of invisibility in the hospital corridors of Norfolk, Virginia, the civilian nurse who changed bedpans without complaint, who restocked supply carts with mechanical efficiency, whose hands never shook and whose eyes never held questions. The staff called her quiet. Reliable. The kind of nurse you didn't notice because she was always exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what was asked, then disappearing. What they didn't know was that the woman in scrubs pressing hospital corners so sharp they could cut glass had once commanded a team of 12 operators through the streets of Kandahar. That her hands had held lives together in caves lit only by headlamps and desperation. That she'd earned a Navy Cross before her 30th birthday, then walked away from all of it because the nightmares had started winning. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax hit her as she clocked in at 6:47 in the morning. Her badge clipped to her pocket with the precision of someone who'd worn a uniform that mattered. The unit was already humming, 3 nurses at the station, Dr. Sterling somewhere in the back reviewing charts, the ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in rooms down the hall. Katie moved past them all without acknowledgement, heading to her locker. The pair of worn combat boots sat wrapped in plastic at the bottom, exactly where she'd left them 3 years ago. Size 10. Scuffed at the heel from 1,000 patrol walks through hostile terrain. She'd never worn them since the PTSD diagnosis, since the VA psychiatrist had recommended she step back from active duty, since she'd realized that if she stayed in that life any longer, she'd bring it home to Tommy. Her son didn't need a mother who woke up at 3 in the morning checking corners for IEDs. He needed someone who could be present. Someone who could heal instead of destroying. So she'd become invisible. She'd left her unit without explanation. Left Norfolk. Gone north for 18 months, worked under a different name at a hospital in Pennsylvania, then drifted back here 2 years ago, knowing Tommy was stationed at Fort Story just 10 miles south. Close enough to matter. Far enough to hide. The medical credentials were real, her nursing degree was legitimate, the background check had cleared because technically she'd been on medical leave, not AWOL, though the paperwork made no sense if you looked too closely. Which no one did. No one ever looked closely at the quiet nurse. Katie closed her locker and moved into the unit. The morning light filtered through the windows with the quality of winter glass, pale, distant, cold. Unit 7 held 12 beds, 8 of them occupied. Room 7-3 had a post-surgical patient with a drain that needed monitoring. 7-5 had a cardiac case, unstable since admission. 7-8 was empty, the sheets folded with the kind of precision that suggested someone had been expecting it to stay that way. She was halfway through her room checks when the overhead page crackled, trauma activation. Incoming 5 minutes. Single GSW to the lower abdomen, 2-liter fluid bolus already running. Gunshot wound. Katie's body didn't react, no adrenaline spike, no quickened breathing. The calm was muscle memory. This was what she was trained for, what she'd been doing for years before she became a ghost. She moved into the unit's trauma space, pulling on fresh gloves, noting the 4 stands that needed to be positioned, the crash cart that would need to be staged just outside the door. The ambulance sirens grew louder. Then the bay doors opened and the stretcher came through, medics calling vitals in the clipped tones of people who'd seen too much, male, late 30s, conscious and alert, pressure 216/98, heart rate 124, 2 large bore 4s running, morphine on board, ETA to OR 9 minutes. And then the patient's face came into view, and Katie's clipboard hit the floor. She didn't think. Her hand just opened and it clattered against the tile with the sound of something breaking. Her vision narrowed. The fluorescent light suddenly seemed too bright, the antiseptic smell too sharp, the world too loud and too small all at once. It was Captain James Harding. Army Ranger. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The man who'd led her son through 3 tours of Afghanistan. The man who'd sent her a letter 2 years ago, handwritten, no official letterhead, just his voice on paper saying, "Your son saved my life today. I wanted you to know that." He's the bravest man I've ever served with, and his mother should know that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. She hadn't understood that last sentence then. Hadn't let herself understand it. But Harding knew something. Even in that letter, written by a man who'd never met her, never looked in her file, never asked questions, he'd known something. Katie watched the medics transfer him to the trauma bed, his abdomen already prepped and draped, his eyes moving across the room with the methodical scan of someone trained to assess threats. His gaze caught hers for just a fraction of a second, and his eyes changed. Something registered. Not recognition exactly, but something like it. His mouth moved. His voice came out rough from the sedation and pain. Morrison. Where's Tommy Morrison? The room seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Sterling hadn't arrived yet, the other nurses were occupied with equipment setup, the trauma surgeon was 3 minutes out. There was a window of maybe 5 seconds where Katie could breathe, could think, could process what was happening. Harding's hand moved, reaching across the bed toward her. Tell Sergeant Morrison, tell him Ranger 6 is still standing. She picked up her clipboard. The pen in her pocket was a standard hospital pen, blue ballpoint, nothing special. Her hand took it. Her professional voice, the one she'd been using for 2 years, the careful, deferential one, emerged. The surgeon's on the way, Captain. You're stable. You're going to be fine. But her hands were shaking. Not visibly. Not the kind of shaking that would show in her performance or be obvious to anyone watching. But internally, the trembling was real, the kind that comes from a door opening that you'd spent years welding shut. Harding was here. Tommy's commanding officer was here, in her unit, asking for her son's name, calling himself Ranger 6 in a way that only made sense if Tommy had told him about the woman he'd lost touch with years ago, the mother who'd disappeared from his life without explanation. She checked his first sights. The lines were clean, both large-bore access points already running at wide open. His pressure was holding. His abdomen was tender but warm, not the ice-cold shock of someone bleeding out internally. The medics had done good work. Excellent work. But he needed the OR, and he needed it fast. You're going to surgery, she said, and her voice was steady now, the training reasserting itself. Dr. Reeves will be taking you. You're in good hands. Harding's eyes closed. He was going under from the combination of pain medication and blood loss, his body shutting down the non-essentials. Tell Tommy. But then the doors opened and Dr. Sterling walked in, already moving, already snapping orders like someone who'd forgotten he was supposed to wait for the actual trauma surgeon. Get me a full workup. Type and cross. Lactate, CBC, comprehensive metabolic panel. I want portable films before he goes anywhere near the OR. Morrison, you're on monitoring. Vitals every 2 minutes, push another liter of ringers. The way Sterling said her name was different. Clipped. Testing. His eyes moved from the patient to Katie and held there for just a moment longer than was professional. He saw the clipboard still clenched in her hands. He saw the way she was standing closer to the bed than protocol required. He saw something that made his expression shift, subtle but definite, like a predator catching wind of something interesting. Dr. Sterling was a man who'd made his career on noticing vulnerabilities. He'd bought his third vacation home by finding weak points in hospital systems and exploiting them, phantom consultations that he split fees on, medical supply contracts that went to his brother-in-law's company, kickback arrangements so perfectly structured that they'd never triggered an audit. He was competent at his job, which was what made him dangerous. He knew how to read people. And right now, he was reading Katie Morrison like she was written in a language he'd suddenly learned to speak. The trauma surgeon arrived. Dr. Reeves, the real deal, the woman with 17 years of combat surgery experience in Iraq and Afghanistan before she'd come to Oak Creek. She took one look at Harding and moved him directly to the OR, no time for additional imaging, instinct and experience overriding protocol because Harding's lactate was starting to climb and that meant internal bleeding, meant the window was closing. Katie watched them wheel him out. Watched Harding's hand slip off the bed rail as they moved him toward the doors. Watched the possibility of connection disappear around the corner and toward the surgical suite. And then she felt Sterling's presence beside her, not quite touching, just near enough to feel like a violation of space. "You know that patient," he said. Not a question. Katie kept her eyes on the now empty trauma bay. "I don't know him." "That's not what your body language said." Sterling's voice was quiet, conversational, the tone of someone who'd just found a piece of information he could use. "Interesting. I'll have to look into his chart. See if there's a connection I'm missing. Personnel files are usually quite thorough." He walked away before she could respond. Katie stood in the trauma bay with the stainless steel gleaming around her, the fluorescent lights humming their electric song, and felt the door she'd welded shut begin to crack open. 3 days. She had 3 days before everything that was going to happen, happened. Friday morning round started like every Friday morning at Oak Creek Memorial, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone, the hallway smelling of antiseptic and something underneath it, something like fear. Katie was replacing Captain Harding's chest dressing when Dr. Sterling appeared with his coterie of residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. Harding's wife sat in the chair beside the bed, their teenage daughter standing near the window, both of them watching Katie work with the careful attention of people who understood that this man's survival depended on details. Katie had positioned the sterile field exactly right. Figure-8 wrap, reinforced at the anchor points, pressure distributed across the thoracic wall to prevent fluid buildup while allowing the wound to breathe. It was textbook. It was also the method they'd taught her 12 years ago, in a forward operating base outside Kandahar, where a combat medic had shown her how to dress a wound that might need to hold for 72 hours in a Black Hawk with no hospital anywhere within reach. "Nurse Morrison," Sterling's voice cut across the room like a scalpel, "are you actually using a figure-8 wrap on a thoracic wound? Did they not cover basic bandaging in whatever program you attended?" The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a young woman named Chen, looked genuinely uncomfortable. Harding's wife straightened in her chair. Katie took one measured breath. "This technique prevents. I'll decide what's appropriate, Nightingale." Sterling stepped forward and began unwrapping her work, his movements deliberately rough, pulling at the tape edges with more force than necessary. His hands weren't steady like hers. His hands were angry. He rewrapped the dressing while lecturing about her concerning lack of fundamentals and troubling gaps in her basic training, his voice pitched loud enough that people in the hallway could hear. He was performing. The residents were his audience. Harding's wife was his witness. When he finished, he stepped back and smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't happiness, but rather the expression of someone who'd successfully made a point and enjoyed doing it. "We'll need to schedule remedial training for you, Morrison. Can't have standards slipping on my unit." "Of course, Doctor," Katie said, and her voice was exactly what he wanted to hear, small, apologetic, diminished. She didn't look at Harding's daughter. She didn't look at his wife. She cleaned up the used dressings and stepped out of the room while Sterling was still talking, his words following her down the hallway like a scent she couldn't wash off. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Katie walked past the nursing station and saw it, a white sheet of paper on the public board beside the time clock where every staff member checked in and out. Her name printed at the top. N. Morrison, emotional instability and poor judgment, counseling required. The disciplinary write-up was posted where everyone could see it, where it would stay for the next 5 days before being filed in her personnel record. It was the institutional equivalent of painting a target on her back. She stood reading it while staff members hurried past without meeting her eyes. A medical assistant she'd worked with for 14 months, good woman, 2 kids, always brought homemade tamales to the break room, glanced at the board, then at Katie, then quickly away. The calculation was visible on her face. The fear was audible in her silence. By Monday morning, the break room pattern had established itself with the inevitability of water finding its level. Katie would enter with her lunch, sit at the corner table near the refrigerator where the ice maker made a sound like distant gunfire, and within 90 seconds every other nurse had found a reason to leave. Someone suddenly remembered they needed to check a medication order. Someone else realized they'd forgotten their phone. A third nurse stood abruptly and announced she needed to use the restroom. One resident whispered to another, loud enough for Katie to hear, "Sterling's gunning for her. I'm not getting caught in the crossfire." Katie ate alone, her sandwich untouched, staring at the institutional beige walls that hadn't been painted since the hospital's expansion in 2008. She understood perfectly what was happening. Understanding didn't make it hurt less. Understanding made it hurt differently. The way you understand a wound is infected before the fever sets in. By Tuesday morning, Sterling's strategy had shifted. It wasn't social anymore. This was something else. He called her into his office with a witness present, the head of pharmacy, a man named Daniels who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Sterling gestured to a chair. The office smelled like expensive cologne and something underneath it, something like rot. "We're missing Delorded from the medication cart you managed Saturday night," Sterling said, sliding a piece of paper across his desk. "The logs show your badge access." Katie read the document. Her badge code. A timestamp. A notation, Delorded 10 milligrams, 3 vials, removed 2,247 hours, a Morrison badge access. She knew exactly what she'd done Saturday night. She knew because she kept a detail in her head the way some people kept phone numbers, the precise location of every medication she'd touched, every dose she'd documented, every second accounted for, because that was how you survived in environments where nobody watched you except with suspicion. "I logged everything correctly," Katie said, and her voice was calm, barely above a whisper. The kind of quiet that comes from not wanting to disturb anything, from existing in the smallest possible space. Sterling smiled and slid another document across the desk. Falsified records. His falsification, not hers. The timestamps didn't even match the medication administration times. A first-year pharmacy student would have caught the inconsistency. "These say otherwise," Sterling said. Katie let one tear fall. Just one. The kind of tear that would read perfectly to Daniels as the tear of a guilty woman breaking under pressure. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice had changed. The quiet was gone. Something else had moved into that space. "I've faced worse than you, doctor, and I'm still standing." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Sterling's expression faltered for exactly 1 second, the second it took for him to understand that he'd just received information, not just delivered it. The second it took for him to recognize that something had changed in her face, something architectural, like granite shifting. Then he smiled again. A different smile. A hunting smile. "We'll see about that." Daniels was already standing, already leaving, wanting no part of whatever was about to happen next. What Katie didn't know, not yet, was that Sterling had been billing phantom consultations for 18 months. Not yet did she know about the kickback arrangement with the medical supply contractor, the $47,000 that had moved through secondary accounts, the hospital compliance audit that would begin next week. What she didn't know was that Sterling recognized in her the particular danger of a person with integrity, someone who noticed discrepancies, someone who kept meticulous records, someone who would ask questions and refuse to accept convenient answers. She was a threat to him in ways that had nothing to do with a nursing dispute. What she did know was that she'd just dropped her careful invisibility for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to see that underneath the scrubs and the deferent posture lived something that had survived far worse than his small institutional cruelties. And that was when everything accelerated. Wednesday afternoon. The alarms came first, the screaming electronic protest of a monitor detecting something wrong. Katie was charting at the nurse's station when the sound cut through her thoughts like a knife. Harding's room. She ran. The first-year resident, Dr. Chen, was frozen at the bedside with a stethoscope pressed against Harding's chest, his face the color of old paper. Harding's wife was calling his name. The monitor showed a pattern that shouldn't exist, electrical activity with no corresponding pressure, a heart that was moving but not pumping. Muffled heart sounds, distended neck veins, BP crashing, Chen's voice cracked. "I'll call cardiothoracic, get him to OR." "There's no time," Katie said quietly. She moved to the crash cart with a fluidity that didn't belong in this hospital, that belonged to different spaces, different emergencies, the kind where a helicopter was for minutes away and that was too long. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own toward the ultrasound machine, drawing up lidocaine, finding the sterile kit for pericardiocentesis, the procedure for draining fluid that was suffocating a heart. "Nurse Morrison, what are you?" Chen started. "Step back, doctor." Her voice carried a command she hadn't used in 2 years. The kind of command that made people move before they understood why. Chen stepped back. Harding's wife watched with her hand pressed to her mouth. Katie positioned the ultrasound probe, identified the fluid collection around the pericardial sac, exactly 80 milliliters of blood-tinged fluid that was preventing Harding's heart from beating effectively. She marked the entry point with precision. 1 intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The same angle she'd used in caves with nothing but headlamps and morphine, the same steady hands that had held lives together in spaces where failure meant death became someone else's problem. She inserted the needle. Advancing slowly. Ultrasound guidance creating a visual pathway. 45 seconds. 60 seconds. The needle finding the fluid pocket. The syringe beginning to fill with the very thing that had been killing him. O2 sat climbing. 68. 72. 80. She withdrew 80 milliliters total. Harding's blood pressure began moving upward. His eyes flickered open. His wife made a sound like a prayer. For minutes. The entire procedure took for minutes. Chen was staring at her like she'd just spoken a language he didn't know existed. "Where did you learn?" But Katie was already walking out, already moving back into the hallway where the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. And in the window to Harding's room, she saw Dr. Sterling with his phone to his ear, watching her, his expression calculating and cold, the look of someone who'd just understood something important about the person he'd been trying to destroy. By Thursday morning, the machinery Sterling had set in motion was already grinding. He wasn't in his office, he was in the administrator's suite on the 4th floor, where the CEO's desk sat empty. Sterling had gotten the same response from Patricia Chen's assistant, out of state, returning Monday. So he picked up the desk phone and made his first call at 7:19 a.m. "Richard? It's Dr. Sterling at Oak Creek. Listen, I need to talk to you about something sensitive regarding one of our nursing staff. There's a credentialing issue that's come to our attention." Richard Whitmore's voice came back cautious but interested. Richard owed Sterling a favor from the country club land deal last year, the one that had netted Sterling's friend $500,000 in development rights. "There's a nurse, Katie Morrison. Advanced skills, but her background has significant gaps. No work history prior to 3 years ago. No verifiable references. When I asked her about it, she gave vague answers about overseas private medical work and organizations that no longer exist. Convenient, wouldn't you say? We need to audit her credentials before she harms a patient." By 8:06 a.m., Sterling had called the second board member, Marcus Hayes, who'd also benefited from the country club arrangement. By 9:15 a.m., both men had agreed to request a formal credentialing review. Sterling's voice on those calls was smooth as a scalpel. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just concerned. Professionally concerned. The kind of concern that made people believe there was a real problem. At 9:40 a.m., he called the nursing school where Katie had received her RN credentials 3 years ago. He identified himself as the attending physician supervising her clinical practice and explained that routine credentialing questions had arisen. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," he told the registrar, his tone carefully calibrated between doubt and deference. "I simply want to verify her clinical hours and her supervising physician's credentials during her practicum. Some of the documentation seems sparse." The registrar agreed to look into it. By noon, she'd called back. Katie's practicum supervisor had retired and moved to Costa Rica. The hospital records had been digitized and were difficult to track down, and yes, now that Dr. Sterling mentioned it, the total clinical hour seemed light for the intensity of skills she displayed. That was when Sterling made the call that changed everything. Patricia Reeves picked up on the second ring. She was the state licensing board's lead investigator for credentialing irregularities, a woman in her early 60s with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who'd spent 30 years uncovering fraudulent credentials. Sterling had worked with her before, not directly, but through a hospital administrator in Richmond who'd owed him a favor. "Patricia, I have a situation that requires your expertise," Sterling began. "One of our nurses has an unusually sparse background. Advanced clinical skills that don't align with documented training, no verifiable employment history prior to 3 years ago, questionable references. She's been working in a Level 2 trauma unit." "That's concerning," Patricia said. He could hear her opening a document. "What's her name?" "Katie Morrison. RN, hired 3 years ago. She's demonstrated competency that exceeds her documented training, which raises questions about where she actually acquired her skills. I'm wondering if we're looking at credential fraud or falsification of her application materials. Has anything happened?" Patricia's voice had shifted to professional mode. "Not yet, but her background gaps are significant. I'd like you to conduct a formal investigation before something does." By 2:44 p.m. Thursday, Patricia Reeves was in Sterling's office, Katie's file spread across his desk like evidence at a crime scene. Sterling slid the papers toward her methodically. "As you can see, her application lists no work history prior to 3 years ago. The previous employment section just says private medical contractor overseas. When pressed, she couldn't provide specifics. The nursing school has already confirmed that her clinical hours were abnormally light for someone entering acute care nursing, and her supervising physician is unavailable for verification. What we have is an excellent nurse with skills that exceed her documented training, hired without a background check that most facilities would require." Patricia made notes in her meticulous handwriting. "I'll need to interview her. When can we schedule that?" "I'll have HR set it up for this afternoon. I want this handled discreetly, of course. No need to alarm her." The intercom buzzed at 2:51 p.m. "Ms. Morrison is here for her HR appointment," the administrative assistant said. Katie walked into the 4th-floor conference room where Patricia Reeves sat across from Derek Chen, the HR director, a nervous man in his 50s who kept adjusting his glasses. Katie's uniform was clean, her badge clipped precisely to her scrub pocket, her hair in a simple bun. Her hands were folded in her lap. To anyone watching, she was merely a nurse called to a routine meeting. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for coming," Patricia began. She had the tone of someone accustomed to people eventually confessing. "I'm Patricia Reeves from the State Licensing Board. We're conducting a routine credentialing audit, and I have some questions about your background." Katie's jaw tightened, just barely, a micro-expression that would have been invisible to Derek but wasn't invisible to Patricia. "Of course. Your application indicates you began your nursing career 3 years ago," Patricia continued. "Before that, there's no documented work history. Can you explain that gap?" "I worked overseas," Katie said carefully. Her voice was even, measured. "Private medical contracting. The organizations I worked for are no longer operational." "Which organizations?" Patricia's pen hovered over her notebook. "Mostly NGO work. Small operations. Not major institutions with permanent records." "Convenient," a voice said from the doorway. Sterling walked in as if he'd been summoned by the question itself. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from Katie, his legs crossed, his posture relaxed. His presence in that room changed the air pressure, not from authority, but from calculation. He'd set this moment up carefully, and now he was going to watch it play out. "Ms. Morrison, I appreciate your commitment to privacy regarding previous employers," Patricia said, shifting slightly in her chair. The doubt was already in her voice. "However, the licensing board has a responsibility to verify that all RN credentials are legitimate. I'll need you to provide contact information, even if those organizations are no longer active. Email addresses, phone numbers, the names of supervising physicians. Anything we can use to verify your clinical training. Katie's left thumb pressed hard against her right palm, a pressure point she'd learned in PTSD recovery 5 years ago. Grounding technique, keep your mind in the present moment, don't let adrenaline take over. Her voice remained level. I understand. I can provide what documentation I have. Your clinical hours from your practicum were remarkably light, Patricia continued, reviewing the file. Your supervising physician is retired and has relocated. Your nursing school records show incomplete documentation. Yet in 3 years, you've demonstrated advanced trauma nursing skills, emergency procedures, clinical judgment that typically requires far more training. That's what concerns me. Sterling watched Katie's hands. They didn't shake. They didn't move. She simply sat there, perfectly still, while 3 people across the table examined the most carefully constructed lie of her life. I worked in difficult environments, Katie said finally. Her voice had dropped half an octave. No more please or sorry in it. You learn quickly when the alternative is people dying. But I understand you need documentation. What we need, Patricia said, is verification. And right now, Ms. Morrison, your background doesn't verify. Which means we have to consider whether your credentials are legitimate. Sterling smiled. Just slightly. He leaned back in his chair like a man watching dominoes fall exactly on schedule. By 4:44 p.m., the decision had been made in Sterling's absence. He'd excused himself from the meeting once he'd delivered his opening statement, leaving Patricia and Derek to do the administrative work. But the outcome was predetermined. Unverifiable background. Credential gaps. Advanced skills that couldn't be documented. By hospital policy, that meant immediate suspension pending investigation. By 5:15 p.m., Katie was being walked out of Oak Creek Memorial by 2 security guards, just routine, nothing dramatic, just procedure. In her arms was a cardboard box containing the physical evidence of her 3 years of invisibility, a cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a dying succulent she'd been keeping alive on the windowsill of the break room, its leaves brown and papery, and a framed photo of Tommy in his Army Ranger uniform, the only picture she'd been allowed to keep on her desk. The guards didn't speak to her. The lobby was quieting down as shift change happened. Nobody watched. Nobody said goodbye. She was simply no longer there. The rain started as she reached the parking lot. Cold Norfolk rain in October, the kind that hammered against the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. Katie stood for a moment under the overhang, the cardboard box growing damp in her hands, the succulent inside already starting to wilt from the moisture. She could see Sterling through the administrative wing window, 4th floor, standing with his arms folded across his chest, watching her leave. She didn't look up at him. She simply turned and walked toward the bus stop, where other people waited with umbrellas and tired expressions, people who'd never worn combat boots in Kandahar, people who'd never held lives together with their hands, people who'd never spent 3 years learning how to be nobody. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling didn't know he'd just made the only mistake that could destroy him. He'd pushed the woman he'd tried to humiliate just far enough. And somewhere in a building with marble floors and bulletproof glass windows, someone had access to security footage, someone had been waiting for exactly this moment, and someone was about to make a phone call. It was 6:33 p.m. on Thursday when the first inquiry came through to Oak Creek Memorial's administrative office. It wasn't marked urgent, but it came from the Pentagon. The message was simple, regarding credentialing investigation of nursing staff member Katie Morrison. We may have information relevant to your inquiry. Nobody knew yet. Nobody understood what had just been set in motion. Sterling was in his office, documenting the investigation, building his case, thinking he'd successfully dismantled a woman who'd threatened his control. He had no idea that the woman he'd just fired wasn't a nurse with a questionable background. He had no idea that the woman he'd just destroyed was going to walk into that hospital 3 days later with the full weight of the federal government behind her, and that his entire world was going to collapse in exactly 4 minutes. The alarm screamed at 2:53 in the afternoon. 3 short bursts. Flat line. Katie was 2 rooms down, charting vitals on a post-op patient when the sound hit her nervous system like a concussion blast. Her hand stilled. Her breath leveled. She didn't move. Not yet. The alarm continued, a mechanical shriek that every nurse in the unit could hear, and every nurse knew what it meant. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 4. Captain James Harding. She set down her pen with deliberate care. Around her, the ward erupted into motion, footsteps, shouts, the crash cart rolling toward the cardiac unit like it was being chased. Katie stood, smoothed her scrubs, and walked in the opposite direction, toward the supply station. Not because she was afraid. Because she'd learned 2 years ago that invisibility was survival, and the rule of surviving was simple: don't be the first person to react. By the time she reached the doorway to Trauma Bay 4, the team was already there. Dr. Chen, the first-year resident who'd rotated through Oak Creek Memorial just 6 weeks ago, stood at the head of the bed with his hands trembling visibly, staring at the EKG monitor as if the flat line was a personal insult he couldn't process. The nurse, Melissa, good hands, 3 years of experience, was already compressing Harding's chest, the sound of it like wet percussion, ribs flexing under her palms. 1, 2, 3. Pump. Breathe. Pump. But nobody was moving to do what needed to be done. The monitor showed pericardial effusion, fluid around the heart, compressing it, stopping it like a hand clenching around the chambers. Katie saw it in the echo data flashing on the screen. Muffled heart sounds. Hypertension. The clinical picture was screaming what needed to happen, and nobody in that room had the intestinal fortitude to do it. Dr. Chen stood frozen, his mouth open, his eyes darting from monitor to patient to the assembled staff as if waiting for someone to tell him what his own training should have taught him. Katie stepped into the room. 14-gauge angiocath, she said. Her voice didn't crack. Didn't rise. Just stated the fact like she was asking for coffee. Ultrasound probe. I need the second intercostal space. Dr. Chen's head snapped toward her. We have this, I'm handling the code. Step back, Katie said. It wasn't a request. Her hands were already moving, muscle memory older than her civilian life taking over like muscle remembers what the mind tries to forget. She'd done this in the dark. She'd done this in the sand. She'd done this with nothing but the headlamp mounted on her forehead and a prayer that the morphine would hold long enough. The hands that had trembled under Dr. Sterling's public humiliation in this very hospital just 48 hours ago now moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon who'd operated in caves. The ultrasound tech slid the probe to the correct space, between the ribs, 5th intercostal, midclavicular line, and Katie saw the black pocket of fluid surrounding the heart like a slow-motion fist. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Blood pressure creeping up on the monitor. 70. 75. 80. The fluid drained in a steady stream into the collection chamber, 300 milliliters of blood serum that had been slowly crushing the life out of a man who'd spent 3 tours keeping her son alive. For minutes. That's what it took. For minutes, and Captain James Harding's heart resumed its rhythm, sinus rhythm, strong and steady and alive, and every person in that room understood in that moment that they'd just watched a woman perform a procedure with the hands of someone who'd done this before, done this countless times, done this with stakes higher than any of them had ever imagined. Katie stepped back. Peeled off the gloves. Disposed of them with the same precision she'd used to save his life. Dr. Chen was staring at her. The nurses were staring. Melissa, who'd been doing chest compressions, lowered her hand slowly, understanding without being told that the emergency had shifted from code blue to something else entirely, something none of them had words for. Katie left the room. She returned to her charting as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with the muscle memory of a decorated military operator, as if her hands didn't carry the weight of every life she'd ever held in them. Dr. Sterling knew by Thursday morning. The hospital had its layers of communication, nurses talked to nurses, residents talked to attending physicians, someone with access to the code report had flagged the incident as unusual technique and possible protocol violation. By the time Katie arrived at 6 a.m. to start her shift, the email was waiting in her inbox, marked urgent, asking her to report to Human Resources before starting her rounds. She'd expected this. Some part of her had been expecting this since the moment her hands moved and the memory returned and she became visible again. The HR office was on the 3rd floor, fluorescent white, the smell of industrial carpet cleaner clinging to every surface. 2 chairs across from a desk. Katie sat in one. A woman named Patricia from HR sat across from her, and beside Patricia sat Dr. Sterling, his arms folded across his chest, his expression a mask of clinical concern that didn't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. "We've received information," Patricia began, her voice careful, regarding credentialing irregularities. "Your background check shows a significant gap, 7 years of employment history missing between your military discharge and your hiring here. No references. No employment record. Nothing." Katie didn't respond. She'd known this was coming. Additionally, Patricia continued, "Your actions during the Code Blue event yesterday were flagged as outside your scope of practice. You performed a procedure, pericardiocentesis, that should only be performed by attending physicians or qualified surgeons. We have questions about your credentials." "The patient would be dead without it," Katie said quietly. "That's not the point." Dr. Sterling leaned forward. His voice dripped like poison. "The point is deception. The point is that you came to us as a simple nurse with a vague background, and now we discover you're someone entirely different. Someone hiding something. Someone untrustworthy." Katie looked at her hands. Steady. Not trembling. Not burning with rage. Just steady. "We've contacted the State Nursing Board," Patricia said, sliding a termination letter across the desk. "Given the credentialing concerns and your unauthorized procedure, we're recommending they open an investigation into your licensure. Effective immediately, you're terminated for gross misconduct and credentialing irregularities. Security will escort you out." 2 campus security guards were waiting at her locker. Katie emptied it in 5 minutes, 2 years of her life compressed into a cardboard box that had held surgical supplies just that morning. A cracked mug someone had given her in month 3. A dying succulent she'd kept on her desk out of stubbornness. A photo of Tommy in his ranger uniform, his face so young it hurt to look at it. At the bottom of the box, someone had already removed her combat boots, the ones she'd kept hidden in the locker, the ones from Kandahar, worn leather that had walked through dust and sand and missions that existed in classified reports nobody would ever read. They weren't in the box. They were gone. Security had taken them. Another thing that belonged to her that she'd lost. The rain started as she walked to the bus stop, soft at first, then harder, the kind of rain that felt like the sky was crying for her since she couldn't cry herself. Katie stood there in her civilian clothes, her cracked mug already soaked, her dying plant drowning, the photo of Tommy turning into watercolor as the rain dissolved the edges of his face. A bus passed. Wrong route. She didn't move. 2 years. She'd given 2 years to invisibility. She'd tried to heal quietly, tried to be someone other than the operator who still woke up screaming at 3 in the morning. She'd tried to protect Captain Harding without revealing who she was. She'd tried to keep her son's commanding officer alive by being unremarkable. And it hadn't mattered. Dr. Sterling had seen through her anyway. The system had rejected her anyway. And now she'd lost not just her job but her chance to protect the one person who mattered, the man who'd kept Tommy alive through hell. Katie picked up the box. The cardboard was falling apart, disintegrating under the weight of the rain. She shifted it to her hip and started walking, not toward the bus stop anymore, but toward her apartment, toward the suitcase she'd started packing that morning. If Norfolk knew. If the state board was investigating. If her credentialing was being questioned. Better to disappear again. Better to go back to being nobody. Better to run than to stand and watch everything fall apart. Friday. Saturday. Sunday. 3 days of her apartment filling with boxes and ghosts. On Monday morning, her phone rang. The caller ID said White House switchboard. Katie almost deleted it. She was standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 3 hours ago, staring at a half-packed suitcase, and her phone rang with a number that had to be spam, had to be impossible, had to be the universe playing a sick joke on a woman who'd already given everything. She answered. Ms. Morrison, a woman's voice said, professional and formal, the President would like to extend an invitation to a ceremony honoring your recent act of extraordinary medical courage. Someone forwarded security footage from Oak Creek Memorial. We understand you're no longer employed there, but your actions saving Captain Harding's life have been deemed worthy of recognition. Katie sat down hard on the suitcase. I don't understand. A military transport will arrive Tuesday morning. We'll send details within the hour. The call ended. Katie stared at her phone. Then at the box with the cracked mug. Then at the dying succulent, which seemed impossible. Nothing this fragile could survive this long. She started laughing. Or maybe crying. Maybe both. The sound echoed through an apartment that was already half erased, and for the first time in 3 days, Katie Morrison understood that you can't outrun what you've been. 3 days after the termination notice, Katie's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. White House caller ID. She almost hung up. Scams had gotten sophisticated. She'd read the warnings in the hospital break room, back when she'd had access to the break room. But something made her answer. The woman's voice was calm, official, precise, Senior Chief Morrison. This is the Presidential Scheduling Office. We received security footage from Oak Creek Memorial dated last Thursday. The pericardiocentesis procedure. We'd like to extend an invitation to a ceremony honoring extraordinary medical courage. The footage was flagged by our Office of Personnel Management during a routine credentialing review. Apparently someone filed a whistleblower report. It went to the Pentagon first. Then here. Katie didn't speak. She couldn't. The woman continued, can you be at the White House on Friday? 10 a.m.? It's not a request, Senior Chief. It's a command from the President's office. The line went quiet except for the hum of Katie's apartment, the thin walls, the neighbor's television bleeding through, the refrigerator's mechanical wheeze. She said yes. She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed, still unmade from that morning she'd been escorted out by security, and she understood then that hiding wasn't a choice anymore. It was a door someone else had opened. The next morning, Katie walked back into Oak Creek Memorial wearing the same scrubs she'd worn for 2 years, the ones that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and her own fear. The lobby had transformed overnight. News cameras lined the entrance. Military personnel stood at parade rest. Police cruisers angled across the parking lot. Hospital CEO Margaret Chen stood near the information desk, her expression caught between fury and relief. When she saw Katie, she moved toward her with her hand extended. Katie didn't take it. Not yet. She was here for paperwork. She was here to collect the photograph of Tommy that had been on her locker before Sterling had the locks changed. She was here to reclaim the cracked coffee mug that had been in her desk drawer, the one Tommy had made in 3rd grade, before his own trajectory had pointed toward Ranger School. Before his mother had pointed toward invisibility. Katie walked toward the administrative office, past the cameras, past the uniforms. No one stopped her. Everyone watched. That was when the emergency bay doors burst open and a stretcher came through under armed guard. The patient on the stretcher was awake, conscious, his eyes wide with something beyond pain. His skin was dark, weathered, marked with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent half his life in conflict zones. A drone strike victim, the officer beside the stretcher had said into her radio. Taliban. Custody. The man's gaze swept the lobby until it landed on Katie, and his entire body went rigid. He began screaming in Pashto, the words jagged and raw and filled with something between terror and rage. The medical team froze. Security moved forward. The man was still screaming, pointing at Katie with a hand that shook like a tree in a storm. One of the medics asked, "What's he saying? Does anyone speak Pashto?" Nobody answered. Katie understood. She'd heard that word before, echoing across a valley in Kandahar 8 years ago, whispered through radio static as she'd moved through darkness with 16 hostages behind her and Taliban muzzle flashes in front. The shadow. The American woman. The one they'd never caught because she'd already disappeared. A soldier stepped forward in dress blues. Then another. Then a whole line of them, moving toward Katie with the kind of synchronized precision that only comes from years of training and absolute certainty. The first was Captain Harding, still pale but standing without assistance, his hospital gown replaced with Class A uniform. His eyes found hers and held. Behind him came more officers, and then, stepping through the crowd like a person moving through water, came Tommy Morrison in full Army Ranger tan. Tommy's face was wet. His hand moved to his chest and stayed there, over his heart. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the lobby like a command echoing off canyon walls. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. That's my mother. The room went dead silent. The breathing stopped. The camera feeds held. Harding moved to the microphone a hospital aide had set up, and he opened a folder with hands that trembled, not from weakness but from the weight of what he was about to say. His voice was steady though, a soldier's voice, precise as a surgical incision, officer's personnel file. Classified until 72 hours ago. Kandahar deployment, 2014 through 2017. 3 complete tours. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman, attached to SEAL Team 3 Charlie Platoon. He paused. The cameras clicked like insects. 12 high-risk extractions of hostages under active fire. Navy Cross recipient for rescuing 16 American and coalition personnel from a Taliban command facility on April 7, 2015. The citation reads, with complete disregard for her own safety, Senior Chief Morrison led a 4-person team through the valley of Sanjin into enemy territory, extracted 16 personnel under sustained fire, and navigated them to extraction with 0 casualty. Her actions exemplified the highest standards of naval special warfare. Harding lowered the paper. His eyes met Katie's. That was the worst night she had to survive. But it wasn't the only one. Behind Harding, a man in navy dress white stepped forward. His uniform was a constellation of ribbons, the kind of chest you only saw on people who'd spent decades in combat zones. His call sign was embroidered inside his collar, Graves. SEAL Commander. He picked up where Harding stopped, his voice rough as gravel, 2 silver stars. The room absorbed that. For bronze stars with Valor. Someone in the crowd gasped. Purple Heart. Twice. For wounds sustained during combat operations in Helmand Province and Badakhshan. He lowered the file. I was in the valley that night. My leg was shattered. Blood loss at a rate that meant I had maybe 6 minutes before the math stopped working. Senior Chief Morrison applied a tourniquet with hands that were steady as a surgical laser. She carried me 1.2 kilometers through Taliban fire to the LZ. She kept talking to me. Kept my eyes open. Kept me conscious. That was 2019. I was discharged 2 years later. She was still serving. Still saving people. Still not letting anyone know her name. 2 figures appeared at the entrance, moving with the kind of purpose that cleared a pathway. FBI jackets. Federal credentials. They walked past Katie as if she wasn't there, and they walked toward Dr. Sterling, who had come out of his office to see what the commotion was. His face was the color of old newspaper when he understood. They didn't read rights. They didn't apologize. They just cuffed him with the kind of smooth efficiency that comes from having done this 100 times. The officer on the left spoke directly to the gathered crowd. Dr. Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for federal healthcare fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States government, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud in connection with Oak Creek Memorial's billing practices dating back to 2021. Sterling's mouth moved but no words came out. He was looking at Katie, and Katie was looking back with the kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst. the hospital CEO stepped forward and took the microphone. Her voice carried the particular weight of someone about to destroy their own life's work. Effective immediately, Dr. Richard Sterling is terminated from his position. All investigations pending. All his cases are being reviewed for medical negligence. Oak Creek Memorial is releasing a formal statement of apology to Senior Chief Katie Morrison, extending back pay in the amount of $48,000 and offering her reinstatement as clinical educator in our Special Operations and Trauma Unit. The security team led Sterling toward the exit, his shoes squeaking on the tile with each step. Nobody moved to stop him. The staff of Oak Creek Memorial stood in clusters, watching one of their own be dismantled by evidence and federal law. The man screaming in Pashto on the stretcher was being wheeled toward trauma surgery now, the irony apparently lost on no one. He was about to be saved by the very system he'd once tried to destroy. Katie felt Tommy's hand on her shoulder. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't do anything but stand there in her old scrubs, looking at the chaos of her own exposure, and breathe. That evening, Katie stood in her apartment at the window, watching the rain begin. The shadow box on her living room wall caught the last of the sunset, her combat boots, the one she'd worn through Kandahar and now retired to glass and memory. Tommy's Ranger tab, framed beside them. The presidential citation, crisp and formal and impossible to ignore. She reached out and touched the glass once, a gesture that asked for nothing and demanded nothing in return. Somewhere below, in the street, life continued. Pedestrians with umbrellas. Traffic lights changing. A city that had no idea it was standing on top of the woman who'd been invisible for 2 years. Katie turned away from the window. She picked up her phone and called the White House back. "I'll be there Friday," she said. 10 a.m. "I'm ready." What she meant was, "I'm done hiding." What she meant was, "I'm ready for whatever comes next." If you've ever watched someone sacrifice their own visibility to protect the people they love, subscribe. If you've ever known someone quiet who turned out to be absolutely extraordinary, hit that like button. And in the comments, tell us, what would you have done if the Pentagon called your workplace? Would you have run, or would you have finally let people see you?